ignition.
Because the subject material of One Step Beyond is fascism, and the focus of the program is fascism, international fascism, and the U.S. national security establishment, and because it is my considered opinion at this stage of the game that we are going down the very same road that Italy and Germany went down. In fact, that's been my considered opinion for about 25 years. I've been saying that on the air for 15 years plus. When I began saying this, unfortunately, an awful lot of people looked at me like I had a penis growing out of my head. They did not want to hear about it. That was their reaction. I have a lot of people now that have hung in there over the years who say, 10 years ago I listened to you and I thought you were nuts. Now I see what it is that you were talking about. Well, it is to be hoped, I guess the saying better late than never applies in that context. It is to be hoped that enough people can get busy, enough people will become active, enough people will wake up to prevent a catastrophe. This is something that I read on the air periodically to allow people the opportunity to measure the extent of the society's descent into fascism. This is something that is a description on the part of a college professor of what it was like to live during the rise of Hitler. What was it like subjectively, or what it was like subjectively, I should say, to live under the rise of Adolf Hitler? And I read this periodically so that people in the listening audience can effectively gauge the extent to which their lives, their daily lives in the United States in the late 20th century have become subjectively like the lives of the people who lived under the rise of fascism in Germany, because the same bloody goddamn thing is happening here in the United States right now. If people in Weimar Germany and in the early years of the Hitler regime had a resource like this program, perhaps the tragedies of Hitler's Germany might have been averted, but unfortunately they did not. The book from which I'm about to read is entitled They Thought They Were Free, subtitled The Germans 1933 through 45. This book was authored by Milton Mayer, last name M-A-Y-E-R. It's published in softcover by the University of Chicago Press and copyrighted 1955. It is, as I said, a series of interviews with people who had lived during the rise of Hitler. Some of them were supportive of Hitler. Some of them were opposed to Hitler. Some of them were initially opposed to Hitler and then it became co-opted. And in a chapter, appropriately and ironically enough, chapter 13, a chapter entitled But Then It Was Too Late, a college professor who was opposed to Adolf Hitler from the beginning, but who eventually went along with the program, who eventually became comfortable, who eventually became assimilated into the growing Nazi culture and Nazi society, relates his experiences, his subjective experience of what it was like to view the rise of Hitler. And I think that many members of the listening audience will recognize parts of themselves, parts of the society they live in, parts of the society that they are about to be living in as they listen to this chilling account. In this chapter, again chapter 13 entitled But Then It Was Too Late, Milton Mayer interviews this college professor. And the chapter begins, quote, "What no one seemed to notice," said a colleague of mine, a philologist, again quoting, "was the ever-widening gap after 1933 between the government and the people. Just think how very wide this gap was to begin with here in Germany, and it became always wider. It doesn't make people close to their government to be told that this is a people's government, a true democracy, or to be enrolled in civilian defense, or even to vote. All this has little, really nothing to do with knowing one is governing. What happened here was the gradual habituation of the people, little by little, to being governed by surprise, to receiving decisions deliberated in secret, to believing that the situation was so complicated that the government had to act on information which the people could not understand, or so dangerous that even if the people could understand it, it could not be released because of national security. Let me pause for just a minute. How many things have you heard explained by the U.S. government as necessarily being kept secret because of, quote, national security, unquote? Well, the society being described here is not the America of Richard Nixon, or is it? It's not the America of Ronald Reagan and George Bush, or is it? This is Germany under Hitler, wasn't it? One more time. What happened here was the gradual habituation of the people, little by little, to being governed by surprise, to receiving decisions deliberated in secret, to believing that the situation was so complicated that the government had to act on information which the people could not understand, or so dangerous that even if the people could understand it, it could not be released because of national security. And their sense of identification with Hitler, their trust in him, made it easier to widen this gap and reassured those who would otherwise have worried about it. Interrupting again, think about Ronald Reagan. Think about Smilin' Ronnie and all of the horrible, horrible things he did. But people bought it because Ronald Reagan basically came across as your good old Uncle Al, and he'd get up there and he'd hold that, he'd kind of cock his head to the side and say, "Oh, gee, I realize that this is illegal and unconstitutional, and a lot of people died, but what the heck, I can't really go into my description of it because of national security," and so on and so forth. Once again, and their sense of identification with reading once again from They Thought They Were Free, and their sense of identification with Hitler, their trust in him, made it easier to widen this gap and reassure those who would otherwise have worried about it. This separation of government from people, this widening of the gap took place so gradually and so insensibly, each step disguised, perhaps not even intentionally, as a temporary emergency measure or associated with true patriotic allegiance or with real social purposes. And all the crises and reforms, real reforms too, so occupied the people that they did not see the slow motion underneath of the whole process of government growing remoter and remoter. You will understand me when I say that my middle-high German was my life. By the way, he was obviously a professor of German. Continuing, it was all I cared about. I was a scholar, a specialist. Then suddenly I was plunged into all the new activity as the university was drawn into the new situation. Meetings, conferences, interviews, ceremonies, and above all, papers to be filled out, reports, bibliographies, lists, questionnaires. And on top of that were the demands in the community, the things in which one was, quote, expected to, unquote, participate that had not been there or had not been important before. It was all rigmarole, of course, but it consumed all one's energies, coming on top of the work one really wanted to do. You can see how easy it was then not to think about fundamental things. One had no time, unquote. Continuing. Those, I said, are the words of my friend the baker. One had no time to think. There was so much going on, unquote. Your friend the baker was right, said my colleague. The dictatorship and the whole process of it coming into being was above all diverting. It provided an excuse not to think for people who did not want to think anyway. I do not speak of your little men, your baker and so on. I speak of colleagues and myself. I speak of my colleagues and myself, learned men, mind you. Most of us did not want to think about fundamental things and never had. There was no need to. Nazism gave us some dreadful, fundamental things to think about. We were decent people and kept us so busy with continuous changes and crises and so fascinated, yes, fascinated by the machinations of the, quote, national enemies, unquote, without and within, that we had no time to think about these dreadful things that were growing, little by little, all around us. Unconsciously, I suppose, we were grateful. Who wants to think? Interrupting again, just think about how many people you know who don't really want to think. And so they really don't think. They just go ahead and participate in the things that everyone is, quote, expected, unquote, to do. Continuing. To live in this process is absolutely not to be able to notice it. Please try to believe me. unless one has a much greater degree of political awareness, acuity than most of us had ever had occasion to develop. Each step was so small, so inconsequential, so well explained or on occasion, quote, regretted, unquote, that unless one were detached from the whole process from the beginning, unless one understood what the whole thing was in principle, what all these, quote, little measures, unquote, that no, quote, patriotic German, unquote, could resent must someday lead to,